Yo, welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. In today's video, we are talking about my specialized Tarmac SL8. Can you believe I've had this bike for almost a year now? It's been about 10 months or so, and I've ridden this bad boy about 3,000 miles. Now that we're coming out of the winter time with all of the grime, the mud, the salt, etc., I figured now would be a good time to do some maintenance on this bike, get everything cleaned up so that it's ready to go for the warmer spring months ahead. However, the main reason why I'm doing all of this is because I just got in a brand new set of handlebars that I have been excited to try for about a year or so. So in this video, we're going to be discussing what these handlebars are, the price, the weight, and just exactly why I'm choosing to put these handlebars on my Tarmac SL8. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so the current handlebar setup that I have on my SL8 is the EXS Air-Over Cockpit. This is their one-piece carbon design. The reach on here is 140 as far as the stem length goes, and then the width over the hoods is 38 centimeters. However, there's two problems that I encountered once I switched over to this one-piece cockpit. Number one is the overall effective reach on this cockpit is actually about 7 or 8 millimeters shorter than when I was running a separate handlebar and stem combo. Beforehand, it was still a 140 length stem, but then the reach of the handlebars is more like 78. These are only like 70. So essentially I was down about 7 millimeters or so. The second problem that I have with these handlebars is I've always wanted to try to test out a more narrow width on the hoods. These are like 38 centimeters, even though there's a slight flare in the drops. I always want to try like 36 or 34 on this. However, these retail for like $450 USD, and I just did not feel like spending another $450 just to try these out in a more narrow width over the hoods. Plus, like I said, I still would be down about 7 or 8 millimeters as far as the reach goes overall. So I'm going to show you guys the new set of handlebars that I will be swapping onto my SL8. Now, the new handlebars that I purchased, I bought them off of AliExpress for $85 USD, and that included shipping. You're probably wondering, why the heck am I putting a cheap $85 handlebar on my expensive Tarmac SL8? Well, let's go ahead and talk about it. But first and foremost, I do want to mention a couple of things. So number one is, guys, so this brand, Beluga Whale, who knows, who cares? They do make a variety of carbon components. And I will be the first to tell you that their carbon stems, their separate stems, they don't exactly have a good reputation online. So I would definitely stay away from the carbon stems. However, this particular set of handlebars has had a lot of really good reviews online. And so that was kind of why I was interested in trying these. But the main reason why I'm going with these is because on the hoods measure about 34 centimeters in width, and then they flare down at the bottom to about 37 centimeters in the drops. So it's a flared setup, but they're very narrow. And this is really the crux of why I'm doing all of this to my Tarmac SL8 is I've always been curious to see how a narrow set of handlebars will perform out on the road, going into the corners, descending, etc. Because I've heard a lot of conflicting opinions when it comes to running a narrow handlebar width. Now, these handlebars comes with a nice felt bag if you care about that stuff. I don't really care about it, but just some of this other specs on this handlebars is the reach on here is 79 versus only 70 millimeters on this EXS Air-Over one-piece cockpit that you can see. So I'll have a little bit of the extra reach that I was looking for. And of course, I will be pairing this to a Tarmac SL11 stem on my SL8. Looking at the details of this handlebar, this is very, very nice. In fact, this feels just as nice as the $200 Prime Bikes components carbon aero handlebar that I've been using over here for years and years. Quality and feel wise, these feels basically identical. There are no sharp edges, as you can see when routing the cables internally. This was also another reason why I wanted to go with this setup, is because I'm able to route the cables internally, and I have the option of going full internal or semi-internal as well. But as far as I can feel and tell, there are no sharp edges when it comes to these handlebars. They feel very stiff, and they seem to have a really comfortable position for your wrist when you are in a sort of aero TT position over the hoods. Now, I have had the opportunity to speak to a few crit racers when it comes to the topic of using narrow handlebars, and the results have been pretty conflicting. Those that have raced or do currently race at a high level who use narrow bars say they have no problem using these at all. They find them to be very comfortable and they have no issues cornering. It's just something to get used to. Others who take the more old school approach will say this is a bad idea because cornering is going to be crappy and you're just not going to have enough width to be able to sprint. And I can really understand both sides. And the reason why I asked these crit racers, it wasn't necessarily for myself in regards to whether or not I will be using these to race, because I won't. But I figured I wanted to ask people who would be using this type of setup where they're pushing their bikes to the absolute limits. So only time will tell how these are actually going to feel out on the road. We just will have to find out ourselves. I also want to mention that even though these feel exceptionally robust, the quality, the fit and finish on these are really, really good. At the end of the day, these are a cheap set of handlebars from AliExpress. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you try this at home. If you are using these bars or any sort of similar setup, let me know in the comments down below. But really, I'm basically doing this to test this out to see how it feels. Basically, I'm doing this so that you don't have to. In regards to weight, so keep in mind that these are 34 centimeters in the hoods and then 37 centimeters in the drops. These weigh 263 grams, pretty robust. Now, just for perspective, these are the ones from Prime Bike Components, and these are 40 centimeters in the width. So these come in at 228 grams. So these are actually lighter than the AliExpress ones. So this does just give me a little bit of extra confidence to let me know that, again, these seem to be really robust. Like I said before, the fit and finish on these is really good, and I am excited to get these mounted on my Tarmac SL8. One of the main concerns with these cheap handlebars from AliExpress is the area of which clamps to your separate stem can potentially be prone to cracking under heavy load. No diddy. However, I'm happy to report that the wall thickness of this area, it's clear that this brand, they reinforced this area with extra carbon. It's hard to tell on camera, but the wall thickness is very, very thick here. So I'm confident that there aren't going to be any issues with this cracking. But the main thing is to make sure you closely follow the torque specs when it comes to clamping your stem. Typically, it's anywhere between 5 to 6 Newton meters, but you really should not exceed that at all. And as I mentioned before, the ports for the hydraulic cables, everything is very, very clean. It does not look like these cables are going to snag when I go to route the cables. Unfortunately for me, I have a lot of work ahead of me in order to put these new handlebars on my Tarmac SL8. I got to remove the bar tape, I got to remove the handlebars, and since I've used 2 separate cockpits on this existing set of brake lines, I need to remove the brake lines, I need to put longer ones on them because they've just been cut too short. I want to put brand new brake pads on here, then I have to re-bleed the brakes, all this stuff. So we're going to fast forward, and then the next segment of this video will be what everything looks like with the brand new handlebars on here. Absolutely gorgeous weather in Chicago today. The current date is March 10th, 2025. The temperature is like 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity is like 35–40%. And then we have southwest winds at about 20–25 miles an hour. So we should have a really nice tailwind coming home. I gotta say, I'm so happy to finally be wearing bib shorts again. However, long sleeves was probably a bad choice. The good news is this is actually the latest from Monton. I've been working with them now for almost 4 years. This is their premium flagship collection. This is their velour or velour. It's very comfortable, it fits well, and the fabrics is primo. So anyway, let's go ahead and talk about some of the specs on this new handlebar from AliExpress. Now, according to the description on AliExpress, the tops is supposed to be about 34 centimeters and then the drops is about 37. However, in my real world measurements, in the drops, it is in fact 37 centimeters. However, in the hoods or on the tops, it's actually more like 32. So you have basically a 5 centimeter difference from the hoods going into the drops. So because you have such an extreme flare and because the tops are so narrow, that does make for some interesting riding and cornering characteristics. So let's start off with the negatives when it comes to such this extreme difference in measurements from the hoods to the drops. And there's really only two, and it basically comes down to whether or not you are a climber who lives in the mountains or if you are a pure sprinter. So what I found is when you are climbing out of the saddle over the hoods, it does feel kind of twitchy. It's something that you definitely have to get used to, but this isn't really a big deal where I live because it's so flat here. So I'm never really climbing out of the saddle for anything longer than probably 30 seconds tops, but it is something that you will have to get used to. It does feel a little bit twitchy. And then the second negative I have is, even though in the drops it's about 37 centimeters, if you are someone that likes to have a lot more leverage when you are sprinting, I'm not really a sprinter myself. In fact, I'm not a sprinter, I'm not a climber. I thought I was a puncher. I'm not that at all. I'm basically just a freaking loser. But if you are someone that does do a lot of sprinting in the traditional pure sense, I don't think that 37 centimeters is going to be enough. So just keep that in mind. This is for someone that usually stays in the hoods and likes to stay in the TT position. One of the other things that people have commented about this setup is when you have such narrow tops here at like 32 centimeters, people will say that the steering is twitchy. I actually haven't found that to be the case. Yes, it is a little bit twitchy when you are out of the saddle on the hoods, but when you are actually in the saddle and you are locked into whatever sort of position you have over the hoods, it's okay, because what happens is, even though it's narrow at the tops, which can make for a twitchy experience, a little bit of that is counteracted due to the fact that my stem is 140 millimeters in length. And usually when you go with such a long stem like this, no diddy, usually this makes for a very slow steering experience. So between the slow experience of the stem mixed with the twitchy feeling of the narrow width on the hoods, that basically balances itself out to be a very predictable and steady cornering and riding dynamic. Now, the reason why narrow handlebars tend to be more twitchy when it comes to handling is because since the overall form factor is a lot smaller, that means the steering inputs become a lot more pronounced. Think about the difference in size of steering wheels on a go-kart versus the size of a steering wheel on an 18-wheeler or even a school bus. The school bus, because the steering wheel is a lot larger, that means that the steering is going to be a lot more forgiving, but that also means that the steering is going to be a lot slower. So essentially, when it comes to your steering inputs overall, that's something you have to train for. It's no different than training your body for your aerodynamic position over the hoods, whether you want to have that 90-degree angle with your elbows, your steering inputs, as well as your position on the bike. These are things that you have to train for. They will not come naturally. Now, next up, let's talk about some of the positives that I have found so far with this handlebar setup. So the first one is, the most obvious one, is because in the hoods or the tops, because it is so narrow, it's exceptionally comfortable to be in that 90-degree TT position that I discussed, which is really the whole purpose of going with such narrow bars. Is it's exceptionally comfortable on the wrists, the forearms, the arms in general, and you just feel locked in at all times. I'm never really having to try to figure out what position is going to be comfortable for me. It just feels very, very comfortable overall. The bars themselves, they feel plenty stiff. I don't feel any noticeable flex, and they really do a good job of dampening out the road vibrations. Obviously, when it comes to road vibrations and all that fun stuff, that really comes down to a complete system with your bike, your frame, your wheels, etc., all that stuff. And really, I really appreciate going back to a separate handlebar and stem combo, because it's just a lot more modular. I'm able to really dial in the angle of the hoods, the drops, all that stuff. And unfortunately, just with those EXS Aero handlebars, you're locked into that because it's a one-piece cockpit. So if you are someone that does really like to tweak your setup over the hoods and then your handlebar, really going with a separate handlebar and stem combo makes the most sense. Bro, look at that saddle to bar drop. It's crazy, man. Shout out to my long arms. Shout out to my daddy for giving me the genetics, winning the genetic lottery with such long arms. But recently, I've been playing around with my bike fit just ever so slightly, because I have been trying to train and practice in that 90-degree elbow position. I've had to move my saddle just slightly forward a little bit. I am still running 170mm cranks, but so far, just as a complete package, a complete system, this Tarmac SL8 Pro frame set is fantastic. And I will have a separate video on these wheels as soon as the embargo is lifted. Y'all, This is the most ghetto handlebar wrap you probably have ever seen. Feel free to roast me in the comments down below. Basically what happened was, despite the fact that this bike is probably like $8,000, for some reason I tend to be cheap when it comes to purchasing new handlebar tape. So I've used this handlebar tape about 3 times, and what happens is every time I go to re-wrap it on a new set of bars, they basically get so stretched out that this basically happens where you get this kind of weird fraying here. So I promise you it's not because of my bad wrapping job. A little bit, I'm gonna be honest, I ain't gonna cap, but it's just because the tape is just so stretched out now that they kind of have lost their elasticity. So yeah, I'm just being cheap. Supercast bar tape is like $45 now, and bro, I ain't paying $45 for no bar tape. But let me know in the comments down below if you can recommend me a set of handlebar tape. So in conclusion, the main takeaway for these handlebars is there's going to be some compromises on both sides of the spectrum. If you find yourself spending a lot of time out of the saddle, whether that's climbing up a hill, mountain, you do a lot of sprinting, or if you just aren't really that good at handling your bike, then I don't think this design is the most optimal for that type of rider. However, if you're like myself, where you do 90% of your rides solo, you're trying to optimize your fit to eke out every single watt you possibly can, then these for sure are by far the most comfortable set of handlebars that I have tested so far, particularly when you are over the hoods. So that's really, I think, who these bars are for. Someone that can hold that narrow position and spends a lot of time in the hoods, in the saddle. But of course, I'll have to do a lot more testing over these over the upcoming months, spring and summer. But as always, guys, questions, comments, and concerns, please feel free to leave them down below, and I will check you guys on the next one. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the ER.